Hello, Pastor James Riddle here, Wake Forest, North Carolina. I'm doing this video for people to explain what cultural Christianity is. Not so much cultural Christianity, but how to identify a culturally Christian church. And many churches are definitely culturally Christian. When I was young, I grew up in a church in North Carolina. It was a Southern Baptist church, ran a few hundred people on Sunday morning, wasn't a very large church. At the time I grew up out there, it was fairly rural, tobacco fields, but now that area is very, very built up. But I grew up in not really what you would call a country church, but it was a lot of country people, Southern Baptist church. Now, I remember the 1956 and the 1975 Broadman hymnals when I was a kid. Now, I don't think I knew what year they were printed back then, but later on I realized that's what I was used to. I remember going to RAs called Royal Ambassadors, and then there were the GAs, I think called Girls in Action, and that was the missions groups. The kids learned about missions. I don't remember much about what I learned back then, but I remember doing RAs, and there was training union when I was really young. I believe our church even did away with that probably in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. But that's what I remember. I remember the deacons of the church were kind of the big shots. They were the ones everybody kind of looked up to. And our church became pretty liberal after a while. And we had women deacons, which is something that many of the people there pretty much knew was not a biblical thing to do, especially considering in Southern Baptist churches how deacons tend to run the show when clearly biblically that's not their job. And what's interesting is the church I went to actually took a pretty conservative turn, and it's a fairly healthy church from what I can tell. It got very big because of the growth in the area near Raleigh where I'm from. And so what we're looking at now in a lot of these churches, especially these Southern Baptist churches, is we're looking at the post-conservative resurgence. What happened in 1979 is Adrian Rogers was elected as the president of the convention, and over a period of a number of years, the presidency of the convention was captured, and trustees were changed in the different schools and things like that. So what happened is Southeastern Seminary, where I did my master's degree at, where I've worked on my doctorate there, that school was extremely liberal, the most liberal Southern Baptist school of the 6 seminaries. Until the late 80s when Dr. Drummond came in, and then Dr. Patterson came in, and I was there not long after he started. And of course the school is very good now, very biblical, very strong. But there are some things from the old mindset that still stuck around in most of these churches. And the biggest thing would be probably democracy, this idea of a radical democracy. Everybody has a vote in a church. So what you have is you have a 14-year-old kid who the parents would never dare let this 14-year-old kid vote on how to spend the money in their own checkbook. Well, should we pay the insurance this month, Junior? They would never ask him that, but they think he has the authority to come into the local church and decide whether a pastor is hired or not, or whether they will build a new building or not. It's just absolute insanity. And it's a radical democracy. Everybody has a word. Everybody has a say-so. And that stuck around in Baptist churches, and I think it stuck around a lot in Pentecostal churches too, from things I've heard from good friends of mine who have served in Pentecostal churches. So this is what we're looking at. And there are signs of the culturally conservative church. A lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video have to do with things I've seen, things I've experienced. I've served in 3 traditional churches, 1 in Maryland and 2 in Florida, and I've also been involved in church starts. So most of what I'll talk about, just about all of it, has to do with traditional churches I have served in. And one church I really have no examples much to give. I had some issues there I dealt with that were difficult, but not terribly difficult. Another church which was pretty difficult in certain areas, and then there's one in particular that definitely the lion's share of my examples probably would come from that church. But all these churches had good people, really good people, and unfortunately they just had certain people in leadership that were not so great. Anyway, here are some signs of a culturally conservative church. Number one, and I'm just saying number one. I don't even have a list here, just a few handwritten notes. Number one, music above Scripture. And you will see that in their services. Music is a big thing, and they're really concerned about what kind of music that they have in their services. Now, I happen to have served in traditional churches that had more traditional music, and it can be just as bad amongst the contemporary folks. But it's very, very big. In one particular church, there was so much singing, it was unimaginable. I mean, the pastor would step up there, 12 minutes till 12 practically, and be expected to have everybody on their merry way 12 minutes later. And that's an exaggeration, but honestly, typically I was about 11:35, 11:37 with a service that started at 11. A lot of solos, people singing all the time. Some of the folks, not the greatest singers, some were good singers. But music was very important. Style was important, the amount of music. And another thing too, people that would skip the preaching service just to hear the music. There's people that basically would, and I've been told this too, they would say, okay honey, are you ready yet? Yeah, it's 2 minutes after 11 o'clock now, we'll be doing good to get there at a quarter after 11. Oh, well by then, okay, we'll get there when, quarter after 11? No, well maybe 11:20. Oh, most of the music will be done then. Well, really all we have then is the preaching and maybe the children's message. Let's just not go today. I've seen people that would come in that were scheduled to sing, that would come in, sing their song, and then leave. Wouldn't even hear the Word of God. So that's a very extreme example, but I saw plenty of that. Also, excessive service interruptions. The local church is just a little extension of the local community. I've actually read the scripture, and I still remember it was Revelation chapter 2. I read the scripture I was about to preach when a deacon in a church actually walked up on a stage to tell me about somebody who was in the service from the community that wanted to say something. He didn't speak, but this man wanted me to make an announcement. This man was an actual ordained deacon in that church, actually did that. That's absolutely nuts, but he did it. So I've had everything happen, I guess. A lot of focus on people. They like to sing happy birthday. Notice someone who hadn't been in church in a while. Notice them from the pulpit. It's all man-centered. And when I say man-centered, I mean man-centered, woman-centered. A lot of grandstanding, people that would just stand up and say stuff, popcorn testimonies, because it's all about them. It's all about the people. Also, I noticed this, and this may offend some people. I believe women are very valuable in the church, but a lot of times the women would be under no submission whatsoever to their husband, and they would be very troublesome and cause a lot of trouble. And the husbands would just sit back and do nothing. A lot of times those husbands were in leadership, and they just had a really tough wife, had her for 50 years, God bless them for staying with her, but she would wreak havoc in the church. Also, in these type of churches, they expect a sermonette. A sermon is maybe 15, maybe 20 minutes long, nothing really long, because here's what the folks don't have in these culturally Christian churches. They say, okay, I want 15 minutes and you tell me how to raise my children better. And most of the folks in these churches that are dying, their children are 40 years old anyway. So tell me how to be a better grandmother or great-grandmother, or tell me how to be a better wife or a husband, or how to better maybe spend my finances. They wanted all these practical things. How can I pray better? But they have no concept of what is called stored application. I believe John Piper put it that way in one of his books on preaching. That you can preach a sermon, let's say on Isaiah 6, on the glory of God, the throne room of God, and a person may not get a specific from that sermon that day, like go home and pray this way. Pray holy, 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 like the angels did. But they'll realize maybe a month later, hey, wow, I learned something that day in that sermon that I've stored up, and I can use that now. And also, these churches are run as a business, another big sign that they are culturally Christian. They're run as a business, and the 501c3 does not help this at all. Churches have taken the bait from the state and have become 501c3 corporations, which make them completely subservient to the state. So what if a pastor wants to stand up one day and say, hey, the Federal Reserve is wicked, they're printing fake money and they're fighting these wars overseas that are not even declared, and you were to make some kind of comment like that about foreign policy, And I'm not saying you need to do that very often as a pastor from the pulpit preaching, but there are examples of things like that. A person may hold that it's wrong to conscript somebody to military service. They may hold that there's a particular person running for office that's so blatantly pro-abortion that if you vote for them, you are committing a sin. There are political statements that you can make that could jeopardize that 501c3 status. If you were to tell the men in your church, don't be wimps, if the government comes for your guns, they may consider that a political statement, maybe even a seditious statement, and take your 501c3 from you. And when that happens, you lose it all. That church collapses when they lose their 501c3. And so even a corporation, whether 501c3 or not, if it's a corporation and run as a corporation instead of God's church, you're going to have problems. They'll have bylaws and constitutions. And most of the guys who cause the most trouble have a copy of it with them at all times. They have that bylaw and constitution all the time. When a troublemaker wants to join your church, they want to look at your bylaws and constitution. Some of them have that in their pocket and don't even have their Bible. So that's a big thing, bylaws and constitution. You've got deacons and trustees in the church that form what's called a board. Now, because a church is a corporation in almost every sense, which I don't see that they need to be, but they're generally a corporation. 99% of the time, not-for-profit, once in a while, for-profit. They do actually have to have officers. They have to have a registered agent. They have to have an actual board. They have to have officers. That board could be a president, a vice president, a treasurer. I've actually formed a 501c3, had a church like that before. I was the president. I think my treasurer was the vice president or the treasurer of the corporation. I was the registered agent. Those are realities. People have to sign insurance documents. You have to have this kind of structure. But what you can have is if you're in a Baptist church, you don't have to have elders. I think elders are very biblical, and you should have elders, pastors, elders, which are different from your deacons. But if you have deacons or elders, they can serve as those officers. You don't have to have a separate office of trustee. Trustees basically are your janitors, but we've turned them into this big prestigious position. Your deacons can basically just be the trustees along with the pastor, and these decisions that need to be made to sign insurance papers or whatever can be handled that way. It's not an official office. Your deacons are the servants in the church, and the pastor is in charge of the church under, of course, the ultimate leadership of Christ. Now, another thing is this board concept is a real problem, because what happens is your pastor becomes the CEO, the members become shareholders, the deacons or generally the deacons basically become the board. So what happens is in a corporation, if you hire a pastor, which they feel that they hire a pastor, then the deacons serve as the board, and the shareholders, which would be your members, are, of course, just the shareholders in a corporate sense. So what happens is the pastor's not delivering the proper sermonette. If he's not visiting certain key people in the church, doing what he's quote-unquote supposed to do, then what happens? The board, the deacons, which basically are supposed to be the servants and do what the pastor tells them to do, then can impeach the pastor. They can actually bring charges against him. If anyone comes to them, they can impeach him. And then what happens? The shareholders remove him. It's just like a CEO of an organization. So another thing you'll notice in this type of cultural church, which is just cultural Christianity, just keeping the building going, is with officers and promotions. What are the qualifications for an officer in the church? Well, financial stability. I've never met a deacon that couldn't pay their bills. Okay? They're usually very financially stable. Not saying they're wealthy, but they're financially stable members of the community. That gives them a very strong incentive in their financial comfort to cause trouble for the pastor, knowing that most pastors are not that financially stable unless they're blessed to be in a bigger church. Popularity is another thing that people look for in these kind of leaders. Then there's also birthright. Well, if a person's grandfather was a deacon, why shouldn't he be a deacon? These kind of things, okay? And very, very, very few top leaders, okay, except for like the pastor, very few of the top leaders are under the age of 50, okay? If you ever go to a Southern Baptist church on a Sunday night at 6 o'clock and there's 14 people in that room, and there's one guy in there that's 34 years old, he's the pastor, okay? He's probably not the 69-year-old guy. He could be. But if there is a person that young with a young lady and a kid or two, this is the pastor. So here's why they don't have people under, especially under about 35. Number one, they can't keep them, all right? Usually, there's family problems between some of these carnal leaders of the church and their own kids. And their own kids won't even come to church with them because of the embarrassment they've caused them over the years. Also, even though they can't keep them, they can't even get them because they won't make the change they need to make to bring younger people in. They're going to keep things the way they are. And finally, in reality, they don't want them. And I'm speaking more of leaders. They can't keep leaders. They don't really want these leaders. They'll gather a few 25-year-olds to come in occasionally, and they can just pontificate over them and say, oh, how wonderful these kids are here. But they don't want these young people in leadership. Another thing in these churches that are culturally conservative, culturally Christian, is they are fascinated with titles. Oh, chairman of the deacons and stuff like that. The pastor. Oh, the pastor's got an MDiv, a D-Min, a PhD. What's funny is they want the man to have all these qualifications. They want him to have enough education that if he were in the corporate world, he'd be making $150,000 a year. They want him to spend till he's 32 years old in college and seminary and graduate school so he can have all these degrees. But in reality, and a lot of the churches honestly can't pay the guy that much money, and that's understandable, and that's not what most pastors, I hope, are in the ministry for, but they can't really pay for that, and they don't want it. They don't want the information. You can just stamp D-Min after your name or PhD or doctor in front of your name, but heaven's sake, don't mention the root of a Hebrew word in a sermon. So they don't really want that information. They just want that title because then they are the bosses, they are the board over a CEO that's got a doctorate. So basically that probably gets their necks kind of red, You've got this guy in this neighborhood he's looked up to. He's not very biblically literate, and he's telling Dr. So-and-so what to do. And the top titles in these churches in order, really, chairman of the deacons, that's like your top title. Trustee, treasurer, and pastor comes along about third or fourth. Those are your top titles. Also, another thing, too, treasurers or Sunday school directors, they have very little paperwork, especially these Sunday school directors in these smaller churches. They don't have much they really have to do, but they'll sit in an office during the whole Sunday school hour and learn nothing about the Bible. They'll just sit around behind their little desk, going around, picking up a piece of paper that people were filling out with 9 names on it, and they don't even learn. Treasurers, though they do have more work, and most of these churches they're doing a budget of what would be considered a large family. And maybe even if it's $1 million budget, that's not that much bigger than maybe a few large families. So they're not dealing with enough work to where they have to sit during the Sunday school hour in the office and write checks. That they have to sit on a Sunday night instead of listening to the message, writing checks and going through paperwork. It makes them look important. They walk around with their big notebook. Another thing about culturally Christian churches is the pastor and how he's graded, how he's looked upon, what he should be doing. Number one, his office hours. There are little old ladies who it's their calling to drive down the road to make sure the pastor's car's in the parking lot. I think it would be great if more pastors would build like a little garage outside in the parking lot, and they would just park their car inside that little garage and shut the door every time they're there. That way nobody would know. They'd have to actually come in and speak with him. Visiting key family members, key people. And it's not always the people with the money, but it's the people with the money and the quote-unquote authority and the power. It's the people that they like, the people that they want to feel like they're doing something for. Well, I'll get the pastor to go see you. Also, another thing, too, that they expect of the pastor is he's supposed to let the, quote, people make the key decisions. The people, not the pastor. It's the people's church pastor. It's the Southern Baptist Church. The key people actually make those decisions. They're made vicariously through these self-appointed leaders and deacons and people like that in the churches. But they control these people. These people are scared to death to say anything to them. Also, beware, another thing in these kind of churches, beware of pastors that preach the following way. Oh, y'all are so great and so wonderful. My time at Second Baptist Church has been such a blessing, and you hear that all the time. They'll quote a poem. They'll say, the poet said, and they'll quote some poet, and they'll quote it very articulately. Their sermons are about 20 minutes. They'll just start singing a hymn right in the middle of their sermon. At the cross, where I first saw the light. And the burden of my heart rolled away. It was there by faith. I received my sight. And now I'm happy all the day. Because he's dealing with nincompoops that have never read their Bible, and all they know are a few songs, and they quote these songs and they think it's something. There's no theology in these sermons. Another thing you'll notice. They'll say, hey, you're eternally secure. God bless them. I believe in eternal security. Baptism's by immersion. Great. I'm with you, brother. How about taking that passage, finding the central theme of that passage, and preaching the points of that passage? Okay? That's what you need to do. Well, another thing in culturally conservative churches are power controls. All right? You'll look at their their bylaws, their constitution. You'll see the moderator is not the pastor. The moderator of a meeting has quite a bit of power. A moderator can shut a meeting down if it gets out of control. And if you've got a chairman of the deacons, or you've just got an office of moderator, a lot of times you'll see that that's what will happen, is they will control these meetings through these moderators. Also, deacons basically having a say-so as, say, to pulpit supply. Now, if there's not a pastor there, technically you should have leaders that are elders or pastors in your church. If all you have are deacons that are not qualified to preach, you've got a very weak church. Okay? It's a very weak church. But these men, when that pastor is in that office, that man is responsible for the teaching and the doctrine of that church. It's not the deacon's business. He doesn't decide who speaks in that church in cooperation with the deacons. Obviously, if he's going to bring a heretic in, any member of the church can be responsible enough to call heresy or to say someone's inappropriate. But the pastor is in charge of these things. Also, you'll see Sunday school directors that are just literature orderers. Well, why do they want to just order literature and be called Sunday school director? Well, because Sunday school director is ex officio on all the committees. So they got a lot of control. And so your Sunday school director, your husband or wife it shouldn't be your wife being the moderator, it should be a man. But your husband is the moderator. Look at the power, look at the control you're having in that church. And also they do these things just for power. Treasurers. It's no wonder that Judas was a treasurer. That's a very powerful position, and it should rotate very often. Also, you'll see in culturally Christian churches programs, just filling spots. We got to have VBS this year, Vacation Bible School. We got to have this thing. Let's get this person to volunteer, that person. And you just have programs. Oh, we did something, and you put it on Facebook. Another thing is, knowledge of the Bible among the leaders is typically abysmal. Not always. You sometimes have biblically knowledgeable leaders that play these power games. It does happen. But I know one particular example where I sat in a room with a couple of deacons that had 100 years in the same church, and I'm not kidding you when I tell you they couldn't find the Ten Commandments in the Bible. They made the rules. Well, pastors, I just want to warn you, pastors that are dealing with these kind of things, these culturally Christian churches, pray, number one. Just pray. Is God calling me to stay here? Pray. Ask the Lord to guide you, number one. Number two, become financially secure as absolutely soon as you can. To this day, I still struggle with finances. I want to get to a point one day where I don't. I don't know if I'll ever be at that point. But I struggle. I need to make the bills. Become financially secure. You do not want a band of theological rednecks wrecking your financial future for you and your family. Okay? Decide whether or not to expose the rats. Sometimes you need to, sometimes you don't. Even if you end up in a situation where you don't stay, you may need to expose some things because you want to protect people from this kind of stuff. If Ichabod's hanging over that door, you need to let people know. And let me say something else. A lot of pastors of the bigger churches, the more successful churches, tend to go by this old maxim from business. Be friendly, but not familiar. I say that is a bunch of junk. Be friendly and be very familiar. Get to know your people. Get to know your sheep. Get to love them. And trust people. Trust some people. Some of them will stick you in the back. If they've been there for a long time, for 25, 30, 40 years, they're in that community, they've got no other real identity outside of a handful of people that are liking them, you probably can't trust them. But there are a lot of people you can trust. I say give yourself a chance trusting people. Also, young men considering the pastorate, beware of these signs. And also, churches need to institute discipline and proper structure. That's another video. When someone causes trouble in a church, no matter who they are, no matter how long they've been there, no matter what their office is, make them straighten up or ship out. If they're gossiping about the pastor or about a Sunday school teacher or whatever, this, that, or the other, ship up or ship out. Kick them out of the church if they do not listen. And elders type government, I think, is perfectly acceptable, even in Baptist churches. But we need to distinguish between elders and deacons. Deacons sweep floors. Deacons visit widows. Deacons help to calm dissension when in certain cases, but deacons are not elders. Deacons are men, and elders are men, but they are not elders. Major decisions should be made upon Bible knowledge. So the ones who are calling the shots in that church need to have a very good knowledge of the Bible. And there's just a lot of examples I've dealt with, and I could run through them here over the next few minutes, but I'll just give a few of them. I've sat in a car with a deacon of a church who referred to black people using the N-word. I've had same guy sat down with me one time and asked me to point out in the Bible where it shows that you're not supposed to marry interracially. I said, I don't know where it is in the Bible. I can't find it. And tried to explain how we all came from the same boat. We're all related to Noah's kids, and that didn't go over real well. Had a deacon one time look at me because he tried to run a pastor off. He didn't realize the pastor was financially secure, pretty well-to-do guy, and they tried to fire him, and they couldn't get enough votes, and then they tried to cut his pay, and they didn't quite get it. And the guy looked at me and said, you know, we figured we would just starve him out. And that's when I looked at the guy and said, so you were going to starve him out, huh? And his wife and his daughter too. Okay? This same deacon who proudly voted for pro-abortion politicians. I mean, this guy shouldn't even be a member of a church. Shouldn't even be a member. Should be allowed to come in, shut up, and listen to the message and leave. He's making major decisions. He couldn't starve the guy out because the guy had plenty of money. I think it's hilarious. A friend of mine actually found out that a treasurer was stealing money. And in his church, they had a bishop. The bishop came, had a meeting with some guys, and the quote-unquote board said they didn't have faith in him. And that night voted to remove him. Now, Baptist churches don't work that way, but that's what they did. They removed him. I remember going to a church one time under a clear promise, very clear understanding with all 7 of the people on the committee involved. And had all my stuff moved to the church, everything ready to go, and 3 or 4 days before my first sermon, found out they pulled an $11,400 a year rug right out from under my feet. They just kept going forward. It didn't affect them. Didn't affect their life. These fools will control you, and you've got to learn to pray, to trust God, and to really step into these things with prayer. Now, I have another friend who had a deacon in his church that whenever a black couple, this